My name is Richard Holly, and I slid my father's fountain pen across the glass table and said, if you're gonna cut my throat, at least use my knife. The pen heavy, gold. A small inheritance of purpose skittered to a stop between my son and my partner. Evan's fingers hovered. Victor Lang smiled the way a man smiles when he's already spent the money. I stood because I hate being ambushed seated. The boardroom windows turned the Chicago River into a silver belt. Below, the tour boats moved as if nothing broke up here. Those boats teach you humility. People point up at buildings you bled for as if they're ornaments. I buttoned my jacket, a habit you keep when you've had dignity long enough to forget it's on loan, and waited for the speech they'd rehearsed. Dad, Evan began, and I tasted metal. He was 34 and already practiced in the kind of calm that is really fear with an MBA. This is about stewardship. Transition, Victor added, placing the documents in front of me with priestly care. For the good of the company? I laughed. Not a bark, just an exhale that fogged the edge of the glass. You would have laughed too, I suspect, from the absurdity. My name was on the building, my bones poured in the concrete of those foundations, and I had to ask permission to touch my own pen. Isn't that a joke with a cruel punchline? Would you have stood? Sat? Thrown a chair? Tell me, when your blood betrays you, what is the correct posture? I read the papers. I always read. They accounted for my removal with a delicacy that would have honored a funeral. Retirement, chairman emeritus, legacy advisor. Each phrase a gauze pad to staunch the dignity. I looked at Evan. His jaw was set, too tight, the way it always got when he told half-truths. When he was 10, he practiced lying to me about broken windows. At 34, his lies wore suits. I taught you loyalty, I said. He moved the pen 1 inch toward me. You taught me to protect the company. There's a moment, and if you're over 60, you know it, when the room tips and the future you built reveals itself as a different animal altogether. I could have fought. I could have invoked clauses. I could have called lawyers, or called their bluff, or called for security just to see who came. Instead, I did the most violent thing I've ever done to myself. I signed. The nib caught on my name, Richard, like even the paper objected. The black line of my signature looked like a crack in ice. Was that weakness? Was it wisdom? Would you have refused and been marched out past the interns? Or would you have done what I did? Give your enemy the rope he believes is a medal. Be honest with me. What do you think a father owes his son in the moment of betrayal, mercy, or a lesson he'll never mistake for love? We shook hands. Victor's palm was cool. Evan's was damp. There is a smell to fear, even perfumed fear, and it lingered when they left. I stayed a minute longer with the city. The river kept moving. The afternoon sun lit the smears on the glass until the whole room looked like it had fingerprints. I thought of cleaning those windows myself, of the men who once worked for me who did just that, and how they probably understood more about transparency than any of us. I took the elevator alone. My reflection in the metal doors was a courtesy like seeing your name on a guest list after the party's over. In the lobby, the receptionist who'd been with me 20 years stood when she saw my face and sat when she read it. Mr. Halley, she began, then reached for the safe phrase. Congratulations. I didn't correct her. There are lies that hold people together. At Lou Mitchell's, a corner booth by the window, the coffee tasted like rationed courage. I'd put the signed copy of my retirement letter on the Formica and watched the city lights float in the black surface. I imagined my father's hand guiding mine the first time I wrote a check that mattered. He was a machinist knuckles made of angles, patience like a metronome. He'd saved for that fountain pen by leaving his lunch in the locker room and telling my mother he wasn't hungry. It's a cruel economy. Some of us eat pride to feed someone else's appetite. A waitress with tired kindness topped me off and slid a plate of donuts onto the table without asking. The way people feed grief when it's wearing a suit. Rough day, Mr. Hawley? She asked, not unkindly. The kind where you learn you raised an excellent student, I said. And that's bad? It depends on the subject. She left me to the city. The diner's bell kept announcing strangers into a family that didn't know it was one construction men. A nurse with shoes like melted ice. A couple arguing gently with their hands. The air smelled of sugar and heat, and for the first time that day, I felt the scale of what had happened, not the loss of a title that's a ribbon. It was the loss of the illusion that blood is a contract. I forgave myself for believing it, for needing to believe it. Tell me, do you forgive yourself for the stories you wrote to survive your family? Or do you punish yourself in little ways, like using the cheap napkin when there's cloth on the table? Which is nobler, to trust and be hurt, or to never trust and shrink into your own armor? I want your answer because I'm still deciding. I unfolded my leather notebook, the small black one I bought the week my wife left. It smells even now faintly of cedar and old apologies. I wrote the first clear sentence of my new life. What do I control today? The answer that night was simple. The way I carried my exit. So I called Margaret. She picked up on the third ring, voice cool as salt on a glass rim. Hello, Richard. They retired me, I said. A pause. Not surprised she'd been married to my ambition long enough to know its endgame. Did you make a scene? I signed. I could hear her smile slice across Manhattan. We've been divorced 8 years, and she still knows where my soft parts are. Don't tell me you're proud, I added. I am. Relieved, she said, voice softening. Now you can stop pretending that place was not killing you. Evan? Yes. Another quiet. You'll make him pay for it, won't you? Not money. You'll make him understand. I don't know, I lied. You always know, she said. You're at Lou Mitchell's, aren't you? Have it, she sighed. Have a donut for me, then go home. And Richard, don't let them see you bleed. When we hung up, I stared at the empty chair across from me and imagined Evan sitting there, 10 years old again, ketchup on his lip, asking why machines didn't get tired. They do, I told him. That's why we oil them. I taught him to oil the gears. I neglected to teach him something else, that you don't oil a knife before you drive it in. What would you tell your child if you knew he'd one day push you off the stage? Train him anyway. Hide the spotlight? Walk away early so he never learns how to step on your hand. Is there a right answer that doesn't taste like compromise? I paid in cash. I left an absurd tip because money is the only language some days obey. Outside, the air had that Chicago spring bite-pretending warmth, delivering wind. The city and I have the same sense of humor. I walked past the river toward the brownstone I lived in alone since the divorce. My keys felt heavier that night. The foyer smelled like lemon polish and history. On the console, under the ceramic bowl of loose screws and cufflinks, lay a thick envelope with my name printed in Victor's pen. Richard. I should have known. Betrayal travels with a notary. The envelope held copies, retirement agreements, a letter of gratitude ghostwritten by marketing, an invitation to a farewell party I hadn't been asked to plan. My name, my legacy, my smile pasted on a card with a date and a signature line for the sweepee. My hand tightened. The absurdity of being asked to celebrate the theft of myself almost made me laugh again. And then it made me set the invitation on the hall table and press my palm very gently over my name. Should I have torn it, burned it in the sink, and watched the paper curl like a scab? Tell me, does ceremony matter to you, even in your rage? Do you prefer the clean cut or the dull saw of a polite decline? Which sin is greater, public fury or private disdain? I went upstairs. The house did that thing houses do when only one person lives in them. It exaggerated the sounds. Every stair was an announcement. In the bedroom, the framed photograph of Evan on his graduation day faced the window because I couldn't stand the idea of him watching me undress from man to something less. I took it down. The dust shadow outlined his old smile. I replaced his photograph with a blueprint of our first factory floor grease-stained. The paper crisp where my fingers had creased it 40 years ago. The vowels of my handwriting still certain. The symbolic object of my life was never the stock certificate. It was that blueprint, a map of order in a world of improvisation, a promise of work that made sense. I ran a finger along the perimeter and felt an ache like thirst. I poured myself a bourbon I didn't want and sat on the edge of the bed with the glass warming in my hand. My phone buzzed. A message from Evan. You did the right thing today. Proud to carry this forward. Always your son. The words were dressed for church. I read it twice. Then I did a petty, small, human thing I typed. You have my blessing. Then deleted it letter by letter until the screen was empty and set the phone face down. Was that cruelty? Was that self-respect? There's such a thin line between the two, and it often looks like restraint. Downstairs in the kitchen, where the tile is colder than any apology, I opened the basement door. The bulb on the pull chain hummed. I went down to the workbench where I kept the old boxes, the ones Margaret asked me to throw out, and I couldn't. In the bottom of a crate labeled Tax 9802, I found what I'd been half remembering all day. A sealed letter from my father. He'd written it the week he died, and I'd never been brave enough to open it while I was ascending. I slit the envelope with a pocket knife and unfolded the paper, creased like a map to a country I'd abandoned. "Son," he wrote, in his careful machinist script, "if you ever find yourself choosing between being right and being whole, choose to be whole. Right will not hold you when the building goes dark. Right will not visit you on Sundays. Being whole is the only way a man dies with his hand open." I sat there in the underground hush with the smell of oil and cardboard and thought about wholeness as a kind of revenge. I thought about Evan's clean hands and Victor's polite greed. I thought about the men on the factory floor who used to call me Mr. H when they were happy and Holly when they were angry. I folded the letter back into its paper envelope and put it in my jacket pocket against my chest, where a talisman should go. Now, listen to me. When you are humiliated, do you choose to be right, spend your last good years in court, or do you choose to be whole, step sideways, and build a different kind of monument? Which path would you take if you knew both ended in loneliness of different flavors? Don't give me the noble answer. Give me the one you choose at midnight. I didn't sleep. I lay on top of the covers and watched the ceiling fan measure time like a slow metronome. Around 3 in the morning, a decision arrived without announcing itself. Not legal, not vengeful, not yet. Smaller, more honest. I would make myself useful again somewhere no one knew my name. I would learn what I'd forgotten. How to move without an entourage of expectation. How to earn trust without a plaque. How to hear my own breath without mistaking it for a shareholder's vote. I got up and showered. The water made me new the way a lie makes you briefly invincible. I packed 1 suitcase. Shirts that didn't need starch. The leather notebook. The fountain pen. I took it back off the glass table on my way out of the boardroom. A theft disguised as a keepsake. My father's letter, folded against my heart. At the door, I looked at the farewell invitation one last time and wrote, in small neat letters across the RSVP line, "Decline prior commitment to a life." Petty? Perhaps, but sometimes pettiness is the only poetry an old man gets. So here is the premise. Clean as a blade, I built a company that unbuilt me. I raised a son who learned every lesson except mercy. My weakness was not age, it was faith. Faith in blood and loyalty, in the idea that you can keep the wolves fed and they won't learn the taste of your hand. I suppose I needed to learn the cost of that faith. The bill came due on a Tuesday in Chicago, and I paid it with my name. Tell me, am I the villain for trusting too long? Is Evan the villain for doing what I would have done at his age, only without the patience to wait for my bones to volunteer? Would you have signed? Would you have stayed to fight? Which do you think is the truer form of courage? To stand in the boardroom and set it ablaze, or to walk into the night with only your breath for company and begin again where no one claps? At dawn, I locked the brownstone. The river coughed up a low fog. The city looked like it was trying to forget itself. I put the suitcase in the trunk, sat behind the wheel, and watched the light turn green, as if an ordinary day had any right to proceed. I drove east toward the lake, then south, then west, then nowhere at all, just to feel the engine decide the world could still be carried. By the time the sun cleared the loop, I had a destination. Not a city I knew, not one that knew me. I would sell the lakefront apartment. I would disappear on purpose, and for good reasons. I would learn to be a man without a lobby. The leather notebook lay open on the passenger seat. I wrote the second sentence. What do I want? The answer surprised me with its smallness and its violence. To matter again. You think that's vanity or survival? If you were me 67, name on a building that now locks you out, what would you ask for? A lawsuit? A public reckoning? Or the quiet thunder of a new life that no one has the vocabulary to diminish? I turned on the blinker. I merged. Chicago receded in the rear view like a decision already blessed. Ahead, The interstate unrolled like a timeline I could finally edit. I pressed the accelerator not to escape, but to arrive somewhere I could hear the sound my life makes when no one else is listening. And as the skyline flattened into distance, a small, honest thought lit in my chest like a pilot light that had never gone out. This is not defeat. This is rehearsal. Tomorrow I would pick a new name to live under. Tomorrow I would put on a gray coat and let the world underestimate me. Do you approve of that kind of revenge, the kind that begins with vanishing? Or would you prefer the spectacle, the courtroom fire, the headlines? Tell me, because in the quiet between the city I built and the road I'm taking, I can still hear your vote. I crossed the state line with the fountain pen in my pocket, the blueprint on my wall in my mind, and my father's letter over my heart. Somewhere beyond the flat miles, a city waited that didn't know how to pronounce Halle, and that was exactly the point. I was going to become a man again before I became anything else. Tomorrow I disappear. When I left Chicago, I didn't look back at the skyline. I refused it, that ceremony. Memory, you see, is a jealous lover. It wants your eyes even when you're driving away. I crossed Indiana before sunrise. The lake's still a ghost on my right. And by the time I reached Boston 3 days later, I'd shed everything that bore my name. I rented a one-bedroom on Revere Street, narrow, slanted floors, windows that let in the smell of coffee and old bricks. It was the first time in 40 years I had no assistant, no driver, no secretary to say good morning, Mr. Halle. Just me. And the echo. What do you think a man becomes when his voice no longer fills boardrooms? Hollow? Free? I kept asking myself that. Sometimes I thought maybe both are the same thing. The day after I arrived, I bought a cheap phone and registered it under a false name, Andrew Gray. The clerk didn't even glance up from her computer. She just mumbled, "Sign here." A miracle of indifference. Freedom wears strange uniforms, doesn't it? At first, I didn't plan revenge. Truly, I planned silence. I'd wake up before dawn, make coffee strong enough to peel paint, and walk along the Charles River Esplanade. Boston mornings are quiet in a way Chicago never was. There, the wind bullies. Here, it negotiates. The joggers pass me by, the young ones with their earbuds and limitless cartilage, and none of them looked twice. I was invisible again, and it was relief. Still, invisibility can be a drug. The first hit soothes. The second kills the appetite for return. By the third week, I rented a small desk in a shared workspace near Back Bay, the kind of place with too many plants and people disrupting industries between cappuccinos. I watched them, the young founders with their restless eyes and polished sneakers. Their talk was all burn rates, rounds, exits. They believed the future was theirs by natural right, just as I once had. It amused me how sincerely they repeated the slogans Evan used to sell. One afternoon, a nervous kid in his late 20s approached me while I was scribbling in my notebook. He'd noticed my handwriting neat, old-fashioned, the kind people mistake for authority. "Sir, are you a consultant?" he asked. I looked up. Only when someone listens. That's how I met David Lerner, founder of a fledgling tech logistics startup called Transect. He had the humility I'd long forgotten in myself, the kind that asks before assuming. He told me his investors were pushing for risky expansion, the same fever that had consumed Holly Industries in its later years. "Everyone says to move fast," he said. "But it feels wrong." I almost laughed. "Then you're still sane. Don't lose that." He asked if I'd mentor him. I said I'd think about it. That night, over Chinese takeout in my apartment, I wrote one question in my notebook. Why not help him? But beneath it, another. Or are you helping yourself? The next morning, I called him back as Mr. Gray. Not a lie, exactly, just an edit. Under that name, I started visiting Transect twice a week. I taught David what Victor and Evan had forgotten, that real growth is earned in silence, not in press releases. We'd sit in their cramped office near Kendall Square, surrounded by whiteboards screaming buzzwords, and I'd erase half of them. Trust, I told him, is the only asset that compounds forever, and he believed me. He listened. Imagine a young man listening to an old one. It shouldn't feel revolutionary, but it does. Soon, I realized something delicious. Victor and Evan were courting the same investors David was resisting. Their arrogance was so predictable it became a tool. From a distance, I began to feed small truths into the market's subtle, anonymous analyses of Holly Industries' aggressive exposure and unsustainable growth. Nothing false. Just light shown in the right direction. Truth, when timed correctly, is the cruelest weapon. Would you call that revenge or a public service? Tell me honestly, if a man builds a fire to keep others warm and the same fire burns his thieves, is he guilty or blessed? Every week, I followed the financial news like a mourner stalking the obituary column. Holly Industries began to wobble. Lawsuits, delays, clients pulling out. The empire I'd built on patience was collapsing under their haste. I didn't gloat well, not out loud, but inside, a small part of me hummed with grim satisfaction. One evening, David and I shared a bottle of scotch at the office after closing a major contract. He was giddy, pacing the room like a boy in love. "Mr. Gray, you're a genius," he said. "Just a man with old scars," I replied. He laughed. "Whatever you are, you saved my company." "I didn't save it," I said. "You just stopped killing it." He poured another drink. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Depends. Why do you hide behind a pseudonym? You could be famous for what you know." I sipped. The scotch tasted like memory sharp, aged, unforgiving. "Fame," I said, "is a dangerous perfume. Smells nice at first, but wear too much, and you disappear behind it." He nodded, pretending to understand. He didn't. How could he? He hadn't yet built anything large enough to cast a shadow big enough to trap him. A month later, Forbes ran a quiet piece. Whispers of instability inside Holly Industries. The article mentioned no names, only sources close to the board. I didn't write it, but I might as well have. The market reacted with the precision of a guillotine. Victor issued a press statement about temporary turbulence. Evan, ever the optimist, posted a video assuring employees that the Holly legacy remains strong. His voice shook. I replayed it 5 times. His eyes betrayed him in the same way they had that day in the boardroom. Too much practice, too little conviction. Watching him, I felt something confusing. Not triumph, not pity recognition. He was me, 20 years ago, drowning in his own reflection. Isn't that the curse of fathers? To see themselves resurrected in their children, but in cheaper fabric? One evening, I took a train to Cambridge and walked along the river under the old streetlights. The water moved lazily, catching the yellow glow like coins at the bottom of a fountain. I thought of my father again, his letter, his words about wholeness. Being whole is the only way a man dies with his hand open. Maybe this mentoring, rebuilding, hiding was my version of wholeness. But even as I told myself that I felt the lie pulse under it, I wasn't just rebuilding. I was orchestrating, and I was good at it. Do you despise that? Or admire it a little? If someone steals the world you built, aren't you entitled to redraw the map? Weeks passed. Transect grew stable, profitable. I declined equity, content with the quiet influence. But then the twist came from an unexpected corner. David's CFO mentioned, casually, that Holly Industries had offered to acquire them, generously, urgently. He was excited. "It's validation," he said. I nearly laughed. My son was walking straight into my second lesson. I told David to play along. "Tell them you're interested," I said. "Make them believe they're winning." And they did. Evan himself led the negotiations. He thought Transect would save Holly Industries' reputation. He had no idea the man guiding Transect's every move was his own father, his discarded relic now, wearing the mask of Mr. Gray. In the following weeks, I designed the deal's architecture in silence. It was flawless. Holly Industries would overextend itself, commit to terms that looked safe but concealed a fuse. Once signed, their liquidity would dry within months, and Transect shielded small, debt-free would emerge unscathed. Was that cruel? Maybe. But cruelty has a purpose when it teaches proportion. Don't you think? Would you call it revenge if the lesson fits the crime? At night, I'd sit by my apartment window, watching Beacon Hill lights flicker across the street. I'd pour bourbon into a chipped glass and whisper, "Patience." That was the word Victor never understood. Patience isn't the absence of rage. It's rage domesticated, disciplined, until it can wear a suit and shake hands. 3 months after my retirement, I disappeared not only from Chicago's skyline, but from their memory. My name no longer appeared in corporate filings. My number, inactive. My email, gone. Evan likely believed I was sulking in some Florida condo, golfing my grief away. Let him. Every story needs a ghost to justify its heroes. But I wasn't a ghost. I was a surgeon, and the operation was going beautifully. When I finally laid down my pen one night, my father's pen, the same one that had signed away my company, I realized the symmetry. I had signed my exit with it, and now I was using it to script their downfall. Life, it seems, likes its jokes neat. I poured myself another drink and looked at my reflection in the darkened window. You wanted to matter again, I whispered. Well, Richard, you do. Just not in the way they imagined. Then I smiled. The kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, but knows exactly where it's going. Tell me, though, does that make me a villain, or just a man balancing the scales? If you were in my place, humiliated, stripped, forgotten, would you build something new, or would you twist the knife back toward the hands that used it first? Which path would make you sleep better? Which one would make you feel alive? Tomorrow, I told myself I would fly to New York. Holly Industries was negotiating the final acquisition with Transect's mysterious mentor, and Mr. Gray was about to make his introduction. After all, what's the point of vanishing if you can't choose your moment to reappear? The morning I arrived in Boston, I was nobody again, and that anonymity was intoxicating. But by the third month, I learned something sobering. Silence, if left unattended, begins to sound a lot like guilt. You'd think losing everything would make a man restless for recovery. In truth, it made me slow. I woke each morning in that crooked Beacon Hill apartment to the sound of church bells echoing off red brick. And for a few long minutes, I'd forget who I was. There's a sweetness to amnesia when you've spent your life defending a name. I'd make black coffee on the stove, the old percolator sputtering like an engine that refused retirement, and write one sentence in my leather notebook. What do I control today? Some mornings, the answer was nothing. Some mornings, it was simply how I listened to the noise inside my head. I stopped wearing suits, traded silk for cotton, cufflinks for calluses. My hands looked human again, though the skin still bore the memory of mahogany tables and expensive betrayal. I started walking along the Charles River every dawn, nodding at joggers who didn't nod back. It was a humbling ritual, the daily rehearsal of invisibility. Do you know that feeling? When the world forgets to include you in its script. Some people call it peace. Others call it exile. I still haven't decided which word fits me. Which would you choose? By the time the leaves turned gold, I had begun to build routines that felt like scaffolding around a ruin. I volunteered at a community workshop teaching basic business literacy to immigrants. Men and women who'd never seen a balance sheet but understood survival better than any CEO. They called me Mr. Gray. I didn't correct them. The name fit the life. Unremarkable, undecorated, clean of past sins. One evening, a woman named Alina stayed after class. She was Romanian, mid-40s, a widow running a bakery on Tremont Street. You talk about business like it's a person, she said. It is, I replied. And it always remembers who loved it and who didn't. She laughed, low and tired. Then I have a very moody lover. We shared coffee after that class. She spoke of yeast and flour as if they were saints. I spoke of numbers like penance. It wasn't romance, not yet. Just two lonely people comparing scars. A week later, she brought me a loaf of bread, still warm. Try it, she said. It's from my father's recipe. The crust cracked under my fingers, steam rising like a benediction. It tastes honest, I told her. Honest doesn't pay rent, she said. I smiled. It does eventually. It just doesn't prepay. That night, when she left, I realized something. Revenge had been keeping me upright, but kindness was quietly teaching me how to walk again. Still, I couldn't let go of the wire connecting me to Holly Industries. Every few days, I'd check the markets, the trade journals. Victor Lang's face appeared on the cover of Cranes beside a headline. Holly Industries expands into renewable manufacturing. Expansion, his favorite word. It meant he was panicking. And Evan, my son. His public statements were confident, almost cheerful, but his eyes betrayed the sleeplessness. I knew that look I'd worn it in the 1980s when the steel market crashed, and I gambled my house to keep the factory alive. Pride always disguises fear as optimism. What would you have done in my place? Called him? Warned him that he was walking into the same fire? Or would you, like me, watch from the shadows and let the lesson burn itself in? Is silence mercy or punishment? One night, as I sat by the window reading the newspaper, Alina knocked. "You never told me where you're from," she said, stepping into the apartment like someone testing water. "Chicago," I answered. "Ah, the Windy City," she smiled. "What did you do there?" I hesitated. "I built something, then lost it." "Business?" "Family." She studied me with a quiet that felt like respect. "Sometimes it's the same thing," she said. We ate in silence after that, her bread, my wine. The clock ticked like a metronome measuring grief. When she left, she said, "You have good eyes, Mr. Gray." Sad, but still looking. That sentence followed me to bed. Sad, but still looking. I lay awake and wondered if perhaps that was all life expected of me now, not triumph, not revenge, just a stubborn act of still looking. By winter, I had become something rare, content without conclusion. The city began to accept me. The barista at the cafe near Charles Street started calling me sir. The old man at the workshop asked for my advice on leases. I was anonymous and useful, a combination that once would have felt like failure. Now it felt like air. One February morning, snow softened the city. I sat on a bench overlooking the frozen river, notebook open on my lap. A child slipped on the ice and laughed. His mother, bundled in red, lifted him up, scolding and smiling at once. The sight made something ache deep inside me. I thought of Evan, 8 years old, running through our backyard with a toy plane, shouting, "Higher, Dad, higher." I'd forgotten that voice. It hit me then. I didn't hate him. Not really. I hated what time had done to both of us, the erosion of tenderness, the slow exchange of admiration for suspicion. He had wanted to surpass me. I had wanted him to never need to. That's the tragedy, isn't it? Every father builds a kingdom he secretly hopes his son will never inherit. Would you have forgiven him if you were me? Or does forgiveness require a kind of forgetting I no longer have? That evening, I received an email from David Lerner, my pupil at Transect. He wrote, "Mr. Gray, we've been approached by Holly Industries for acquisition. They're desperate. Should we consider it?" I stared at the screen a long time before replying. The timing was poetic, almost biblical. I typed slowly, "Consider it, but make them prove their stability first." "Patience, David, always patience." I hit send. That night, as snow fell like dust over Beacon Hill, I sat by the window and watched the city blur. I realized that vengeance wasn't a single act, it was an ecosystem. You plant it, you water it, you let it disguise itself as virtue until the fruit appears on someone else's table. Was I proud? No. Pride had already burned itself out in Chicago. What I felt was something quieter, heavier, a symmetry. In March, I visited Alina's bakery again. She was closing up, flour dusting her apron like frost. "You look different," she said. "How so?" "Lighter, like you forgave someone." "Maybe I did," I said. She tilted her head. "Yourself?" "Not yet," I admitted. "That's the hardest one." She smiled softly. "Then start with me. You still owe for last week's bread." I paid. We laughed. Later that night, I walked home under the streetlights, the air sharp and bright with coming spring. For the first time in years, I felt something like peace. Not triumph, not vindication, but a fragile sense of alignment. I realized that even as I plotted Holly Industries' quiet collapse, I was also rebuilding something pure inside myself. Maybe that's the real paradox of revenge. It purges you even as it poisons you. Do you agree? Or do you think peace and revenge can never share the same room? What would you choose if you had to live with one and only dream of the other? I wrote one more line before bed that night. The ink's still trembling from the cold. The empire is falling, and I'm finally learning how to stand without it. Then I closed the notebook and turned off the light, unaware that the next morning would bring the message that would end my peace entirely. A single email. Subject line, URGENT acquisition signed. And with it, the past rose from its grave. The gala was in New York, at the Plaza. all chandeliers and forced laughter. I hadn't wanted to come, but David insisted. Transect had just finalized the acquisition. Hawley Industries, once my empire, now belonged to my protégés. When I entered, the air smelled of champagne and exhaustion. The orchestra played something elegant enough to hide ruin. Across the room, I saw Evan, my son, thinner now. His suit hung wrong, as if defeat had taken his measurements. He noticed me before I could turn away. Our eyes met. 30 years of history condensed into one silent accusation. He crossed the room slowly, like a man walking toward a verdict. "Dad," he said. His voice trembled. "It's gone. Everything's gone." I looked at him, not the CEO, not the betrayer, but the boy who used to fall asleep in my office chair. For a moment, I wanted to touch his shoulder, but mercy is heavier than rage. "I know," I said. "Now you'll understand what building means." He blinked, confused, ashamed. Around us, the crowd kept laughing, toasting, unaware that the foundation beneath our family had finally cracked. I turned to leave. He caught my arm. "Was it you?" he whispered. "Tell me the truth." I met his eyes. "Does it matter?" He dropped his hand, and in that gesture, I saw it. The inheritance I'd never meant to give him. Pride wrapped around emptiness. Outside, the city was cold and forgetting. I walked through Central Park, the trees bare, the lamps burning steady as conscience. Somewhere behind me, the orchestra kept playing as if the world hadn't changed. I stopped by a frozen pond and watched my reflection blur in the ice. I felt no triumph, only release. Tell me, would you have confessed? Told him everything? Or would you have done what I did? Let silence finish the lesson. Which form of love do you think lasts longer? The kind that forgives, or the kind that teaches? That night, I finally stopped being invisible. I left New York before sunrise. The city was still drunk on its own glitter. I took the first train north, sat by the window, and watched the skyline shrink into fog. My reflection stared back at me, older, emptier, but lighter. The kind of lightness that follows collapse. For years, I believed Evan and Victor had stolen my legacy. But as the miles slid by, the truth arrived quietly, like dawn through dirty glass. They hadn't taken anything that was still truly mine. They'd only freed me from the illusion that my worth lived inside walls of glass and steel. The company was never my identity. It was my cage. I remembered that night in the boardroom, the pen, the signatures, the small tremor in my hand. I thought I'd lost everything when I signed those papers. But what I'd really done was open the door. Would you have realized it sooner? Or would you, like me, need to burn your house down to see the sky? I took out my father's letter again. The paper was soft from the years, but his handwriting still cut clean. "Be whole, son. Being right won't hold you when the building goes dark." I smiled. The building had gone dark, and here I was still breathing. By noon, the train crossed into Massachusetts. I decided not to go straight to Boston. Instead, I stopped in Salem, a town that smelled of history and sea salt. I walked along the harbor, watching gulls fight over scraps, and thought, justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just watches the guilty destroy themselves with the tools you once gave them. Is that cruel or fair? Tell me, if you hand a man a map and he walks off a cliff, whose fault is it? The mapmakers or the fools? That evening, I found a small cafe near the wharf. I ordered clam chowder and sat by the window. For the first time in decades, no one knew my name. And it didn't bother me. It comforted me. In the background, a radio played some old Sinatra tune about luck and loss. I caught my reflection in the glass gray hair, tired eyes, a faint, surprised smile. I realized I no longer wanted revenge. I wanted peace. Maybe they were the same thing, just measured in different currencies. I finished my soup, left a generous tip, and walked back into the cold night. My breath rose like smoke, fading into the harbor air. Tell me, after all that, do you think I won? Or did I finally just stop playing the wrong game? I opened the door of my San Francisco apartment with a grocery bag in one hand and my father's fountain pen in the other. Because sometimes peace needs to be carried like produce and signed for like a delivery. Fog crowded the hallway like an indecisive guest. The wood floors creaked their old secrets. I set the bag on the kitchen counter: eggs, oranges, a loaf of sourdough still warm, and the pen beside the sink where a braver man might keep a knife. I live in the outer Richmond now, a third-floor walk-up that smells of salt and old radiators, and I prefer the view west, where the ocean refuses to make promises. It was Sunday. The church bell on 33rd clanged like a tin heart. You want an action? Here's one. I took the invitation I had not been sent and slid it into the flame of the stove until it curled like a salted leaf. It was a photograph of my granddaughter, Lila, smiling in a white dress in a garden in Evanston. Bat mitzvah, the caption said, in a font that wanted to be both elegant and forgiving. My ex-wife had texted me the image and the date. The envelope never came. I watched the curl and fall of ash and told the pen, the ocean, the stove, I will show up anyway. Would you have gone uninvited to your blood ceremony? Or would you have kept your dignity folded on a chair and stayed put? What matters more to you, being welcomed or being present? In San Francisco, I consult 2 days a week out of a shared loft in Soma, where startups come to confess and then ignore me. They call me Mr. Gray because the first young founder who wrote me a check thought that was funny. The name stuck like a stubborn decal. I teach them that a promise is an asset, not a marketing line. Some listen. A few even change. Most just want a blessing to move faster toward the cliff. I give them a map anyway. I've learned that art and mercy both require you to risk being misunderstood. I've also learned how to cook eggs poorly and wash my own dishes. In the evening, I walk the wind-scoured stretch of ocean beach and think about the flat honesty of the Pacific. It erases everything in time footprints, certainties, old men. I speak to Margaret once a week and to Alina twice. Yes, Alina the baker from Boston has a sister in Oakland and reasons to visit. Distance now feels like an agreement rather than a punishment. She sends me pictures of bread like love letters that smell faintly of flour. Peace, I found, is not a place. It is a tuned instrument. You keep it in the right light, and you clean it after each use. It will not play itself. 3 things arrived the week of Lila's bat mitzvah. A small FedEx box from my attorney, a voicemail from Evan, recorded after midnight, and a letter with no return address, postmarked Chicago, that contained one sentence. He died saying your name. Victor Lang had collapsed in his Tribeca apartment. An autopsy later blamed the heart. Though greed had been chewing for years, the markets barely noticed. Men like Victor die, and the world shrugs. The ledger thanks them for returning their shares to circulation, but the voicemail, that was different. Evan's voice was sand and wire. Dad, he said, if you're there, Silence, breath. The sound of a glass set down too hard. I don't know where to begin. The call ended without an ending. What would you have done? Called him back in the night like a lifeguard? Or waited for daylight to test the sincerity of drowning? The FedEx box held papers I had asked for years earlier and then forgotten, an old option agreement dated 1993 that granted me perpetual rights to 3 Hawley patents filed in my father's name, not mine, back when we still believed modesty was armor. When Victor and Evan pushed me from the building, they forgot this. The father of Hawley Industries was not the board. It was the man with machinist hands whose name adorned the earliest molds and whose letter had rested over my heart. The patents had lain dormant for decades, irrelevant in the era of software. But the last 6 months had made them valuable again. Transect's quiet logistics innovation depended upon the same principles. In other words, I owned the keystones of the bridge my enemies had tried to stampede across. I've said I no longer wanted revenge. That's true, but I wanted proportion. And proportion, my friend, sometimes requires paperwork. There was one more document in the box, a draft of my new will. I had sketched it in Boston and asked my lawyer in Walnut Creek to translate my stubborn poetry into law. I could sign it or not. The clauses waited like patient traps. I took the pen from the counter, weighed it in my hand like a verdict, and carried the papers to the living room. The apartment smelled of ocean and coal dust. I'd put on a record Bill Evans, quiet enough to keep secrets, and sat at the small table. I bought at a thrift store because I liked the scratch in the wood that looked like a coastline. The clauses said this: the patents would go upon my death, not to Evan. but to a foundation that would license them for $1 to any company that hired displaced Holly workers at a living wage and offered apprenticeships to the children of those workers. Transect had already met those conditions. The foundation's second clause, though, was mine alone, an instrument to teach humility disguised as bequest. It said that a single share wanted the license control would go to Evan if he delivered the request letter I had written to a stranger and kept it, appointment he'd been avoiding for years. The letter was addressed to Alina's bakery. The appointment was with his own daughter. Cruel, maybe. Or maybe justice wears an apron and forces you to stand in a kitchen you never noticed while it saved your life. I signed the will. The nib scratched like a match. A small gesture, a quiet detonation. How many wars end at tables with nothing more than ink and breath? Would you have done the same, made inheritance a test rather than a prize? Or do you think love should never require a key? I flew to Chicago with the letter tucked into the inside pocket of my jacket and the pen in the outer pocket where a pickpocket could have it if fate wanted to write a different ending. On the plane, I sat beside a woman reading a paperback about forgiveness as if it could be learned like French. Over Indiana, she asked if I was nervous about flying. No, I said. Only about landing. Evanston in June is a well-behaved postcard. The synagogue smelled of lemon oil and whispered expectations. I took a seat in the last row as if humility were a coat I could borrow for the morning. Families streamed in, daughters in white dresses, fathers in suits too stiff to be honest. Lila stood at the front, a small flame trying not to flicker. Her voice trembled on the Hebrew and then steadied. I felt a wash of pride I had not earned. When the service ended and people poured into the garden for sugared pastries and photographs, I stayed put until nearly everyone had left. That's when Margaret saw me. You came, she said, not surprised, just relieved. I wasn't invited, I said. You were, she replied, just not by mail. She led me around the back to a small side porch where the air smelled like lilacs and synagogue coffee. Evan stood there, alone, a paper cup in his hand, the posture of a man practicing invisibility. He saw me and flinched, the way a boy flinches when a memory outruns him. Dad, he said. I brought you a letter, I answered. For later. He didn't reach for it. He watched my hand, the way men watch a gun. I don't need more instructions, he said quietly. This isn't an instruction, I said. It's a favor. For me. For her. Her? Your daughter, I said. She reads from the Torah with the same stubborn vowels I heard from your grandfather the night he taught me to hold a wrench without breaking my fingers. He looked past me at the garden, at the white chairs and the collapsing cake and the photographers corralling families. I failed you, he said, almost as an aside, like a man admitting the weather. Yes, I said, and I failed you too. We stood in the silence that only fathers and sons know how to break. I handed him the letter, and he took it as if it were hot. What is it? He asked. Directions, I said. Not to me. To something you've ignored. He put the letter in his jacket without opening it. You took the company from me, he said, not a question. Did I asked. Or did you sell yourself a story you wanted to hear? My mercy that day was plain, and it hurt us both. If it helps, I said, I'm not here to gloat. I'm here because I'm tired of being a ghost in my own blood. He closed his eyes, the way he did at 10 when he wanted to throw something but chose not to. I can't fix it, he said. You can't, I agreed. But you can stop mistaking apology for defeat. Lila stepped onto the porch then, clutching a gift bag and a look of practiced self-command that made my heart jump its chain. Margaret waved us together like a conductor. Lila, she said, this is your grandfather. We both waited for the other to perform. She offered her hand. I made the mistake of hugging her because age has made me greedy for sincerity. She returned the hug without warmth or cruelty, and that, somehow, was better than either. I liked your Devar Torah, I said. You sounded like yourself. Thank you, she replied. I practiced. I could tell. Practicing is the most honest form of prayer. She tilted her head. My father says that too. And he's right, I said, and meant it. They were called for photographs. We were dismissed. Evan lingered. What do you want from me? He asked. The question ripped bare of transaction. Bring that letter to a bakery in Boston, I said. Eat whatever she gives you. Then sit for 1 hour and listen to a story about yeast and patience. Deliver nothing but your name. You want me to bring bread back? He almost laughed. Is this a test? Yes, I said. And no, it's a measure. I don't have time, he said. You have nothing but time, I answered, not unkindly. You just learned that. Let it teach you. He left without promising, which is, I've learned, often the only honest way to leave. That night, I stayed at a modest hotel near the lake and walked along the water until the wind convinced me I was still mortal. The next morning, I flew back to San Francisco and waited. I waited like a man who has placed a letter in the mouth of a river and wants to see where it bridges. 3 weeks later, Alina sent a photograph to my phone. Evan, standing at her counter, hair a little longer, face a little thinner, holding a paper bag with both hands like a pilgrim. He came. She texted. He ate. He listened. He asked for work to take back to Chicago, apprenticeships for kids from the old neighborhoods. I said yes. Then another message. He washed the coffee cup he used. He didn't need to. I noticed. Reader, tell me, was that a real contrition or a tourist's humility? How do you measure a change you can't weigh? The foundation launched in August. Quietly. Transect's board approved the license for $1. I framed the check in my apartment because it looked like the kind of joke every household deserves. Apprenticeships began in September with a class of 12 sons and daughters of men who had once called me Mr. H. I attended the first session via video, spoke for 6 minutes, and ended with my father's line, "Be whole." I did not say "be right." I have learned that the latter invites applause and the former invites work. Evan sent me no messages. Lila sent a blurry picture of a sourdough loaf with the caption, "Grandma says you know the baker." If forgiveness has a face, it might look like a teenager's tentative text. Then Margaret called. "He's moving out of the big house," she said. "Says he's tired of hearing it echo." "Into where?" I asked. "A 2-bedroom near the river," she replied. "He wants stairs. Claims he likes the sound." "Good," I said, and put the phone on the windowsill so the ocean could overhear our small human arrangements. The last action, the one that felt like a climax and barely looked like anything, happened in my kitchen in San Francisco in late October. The fog had come early. It was a Tuesday. I was frying eggs badly when the buzzer sounded, and when I went down, Evan stood in the vestibule, holding a bakery box like an apology. "I didn't call," he said. "I noticed," I said, and opened the door. We did not embrace. We stood in a kitchen too small for pride. He set the box down and looked at the pen by the sink. "Is that Granddad's?" "It is." He touched it with one finger, the way a man touches a gravestone. Then he took off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and said, "Tell me where you keep the coffee." "There," I said, and watched him find the filters, measure spoons, water. Watched him move slowly, as if the room might shatter. The kettle keened. He poured. He placed the cup in front of me without asking how I took it. He got it right black, very hot. We ate the pastries in silence. When we finished, he stood, took our dishes to the sink, and washed them. He dried the pen as if it were a cup and placed it back where I kept it. Tip turned toward the window. "Dad," he said finally, hands on the counter, shoulders lowered in a posture I recognized from years I had ignored. "I can't undo what I did. Neither can I said. "I don't expect anything," he added. I wanted to say that out loud so I hear it myself. I nodded. He looked down at the blueprint I keep framed on the wall. The first factory floor plan, grease-stained and certain. "I used to think this was a treasure map," he said. "A way to get somewhere I deserved. Now it looks like a family portrait." "It always was," I said. He looked at me and waited for the terms. I did not offer any. Instead, I slid a single page across the table, the clause from the will that granted him one share of something he could not immediately spend. "What is this?" he asked, brow furrowing. "Leverage," I said. "The kind you use on yourself." He read the clause twice, then folded the paper and put it back on the table like it might bite. "Why?" he asked. "Because you delivered a letter you didn't want to carry," I said. "Because you washed a cup you didn't have to wash. Because your daughter texted me a photograph of bread and spelled my name right on the first try." We were quiet again. The ocean breathed like an enormous animal sleeping beneath the city. "Tell me, was I right to bind love to a lesson?" Or should I have handed him everything and called it healing? Which mercy lasts? The easy one or the one that insists you kneel to pick it up? He stayed an hour. When he left, he turned at the door and said, "I think I'd like to work." Not bleed, work. "There's a workshop in Oakland," I said. "Wednesdays. They could use a hand." He nodded. "Wednesday," he said, as if tasting the word for the first time. After he was gone, I cleaned the pan, wiped the counter, and stood by the window with the pen in my hand. The fog thinned just enough to show a strip of sea, gray and unremarkable and perfect. I thought of my father's letter, the way the paper had felt against my chest in the basement in Chicago the night everything ended and began. Being whole is the only way a man dies with his hand open. I looked at my hand. It was open. That evening, I walked down to the beach. The wind bit. A boy flew a kite that tried to pull him into the sky. His mother laughed and chased, the string drawing a bright line between caution and audacity. I sat on a wet log and let the salt sit on my tongue like old prayers. I thought about enemies and sons, and the way cities teach you to measure your life by the bridges you cross without stumbling. I thought about the will, signed and sealed, and how all our documents are just our hopes written in ink that the future will smudge. I also thought about cost. Victory, if this was won, had its bill tucked under the plate. Years without my son. Nights with a phone that did not ring. A body learning to sleep in a bed with no shadows of small feet insisting it's morning. The foundation would help the children of men I loved. Transect would grow in the right direction. Evan might show up on a Wednesday in Oakland and hand a wrench to a kid whose grandfather once swept my floors. But none of that returns a single hour from the years I spent sharpening a crown that turned into a collar. Do you think the price was fair? If you were me, an old man on a windy beach with a pen in his pocket and a name he finally wears lightly, would you want a refund? Or would you pay again for the same lesson? That to be untouchable is not to be feared, but to be at peace? On my walk back, a teenager on a skateboard skidded to a stop at a crosswalk and waved me across as if I were royalty. I saluted him with the bag of oranges I'd bought that morning, and he grinned like forgiveness. At home, I put the pen on the windowsill facing the sea, and the blueprint under the lamp where its smudges looked like constellations. I called Alina. I told her Evan had washed a cup. She laughed softly. "Then he's learning." "And me?" I asked. "You've started to teach," she said. "It's not the same as revenge, but it's adjacent." We said good night. I wrote in my notebook, "What do I control today?" I answered, "Whom I love and how I show it." Then I added, almost as an afterthought that felt like a ceremony, "Peace requires maintenance." We forget that. I fell asleep to the sound of the ocean sanding the edges off the city. Tomorrow, I'll go to the loft in Soma and talk to a boy who thinks ethics are rounding error. I'll pour 2 coffees, both black, and push one toward him. I'll tell him a short story about a machinist who saved his lunch money to buy his son a pen, and a longer one about a company that forgot what the pen was for. If he listens, good. If he doesn't, the ocean will keep working on him for me. But before that, I want to ask you one more time, because you've been here the whole way, haven't you? What would you have done? Would you have burned the invitation or brought it to your lips? Would you have made your will a lesson or a ladder? Would you have stood on a porch and asked your son to bring bread to a stranger? Or would you have filled his hands and let the weight teach him? Is there a better decision I missed while the fog was thick? I can live with your answer. I can live with mine. The building went dark, and I learned to see anyway. That is my reward. That is my new equilibrium. A kitchen where a pen dries on a towel. A will that points toward children I will never meet. A son who washes a cup and says, "Wednesday," like a vow. Justice arrived in a whisper, and dignity came along, heavy as ever, asking for its due. I paid what I could. The rest I owe to the sea. Thank you all for joining me on this crazy journey. If you were in my shoes, what would you have done differently? Let me know down in the comments. Thanks for everything, and I'll see you in the next thrilling story.